Dr. George Dei.
I want to begin by recognizing the land on which I stand, particularly the Dene territory and the Dene peoples, for the warmth, the hospitality, and I want to thank the organizers for bringing me over here. I also want to thank, as a chief in Ghana, I want to thank our ancestors and the elders in the room, because we stand on their shoulders. If there's any knowledge that we do have, it's because we stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us, or those who give us the spiritual strength and the guidance to do the work that we do as scholars, as workers, and as activists. I'm a sociologist by training, and I operate within the two traditions of the discipline. One is the critical, the questioning mind. So we begin to ask questions, the why, the how. But I'm also somebody who is interested in the questions of what ought to be the visionary component of it. So I'm going to be engaging in some discursive arguments or positions, take some positions with you by way of engaging the question of what ought to be when we talk of the indigenous scholar. In doing so, I take up my position as an African scholar who is also rooted in an indigeneity. And I've constantly have to resist this temptation to amputate that indigenousness from my being. I think, to me, we are rooted in that indigenousness because the whole notion of indigeneity resides both in the body and in cultural memory. It's very, very important for me to that. So that's going to be the entry point of which I want to engage in discussions with you. No, the Igbo of Nigeria have some sayings that I think to me are very relevant in locating what I want to share with you. Because it does speak about a question of responsibility, self-implication, and also taking charge. So the Igbo would say, what makes the goat stink is inside its body. It's about responsibility, self-implication. And then they also say that it is only the adamant fly that follows the corpse to its grave. Again, it's about questions of implication and self-responsibility. So I want to move on to the discursive arguments and positions that I want to take with you today. We need to start off with some critical questions. And one of the questions that I want to pose to you is, what are the ontological and epistemological claims that we do make when we speak of the indigenous scholar? The reason why I think this question is so important is that the word scholar, or even the notion of scholarism, right, is embedded with certain understandings, particularly in the academy, that you are supposed to do certain things in certain ways. There's a way to validate, there's a way to legitimize knowledge, there's a way to produce knowledge. And I think when we talk about indigenous scholar, how do we mirror, work with this notion together for indigeneity? And to me, it calls for rethinking our role and expectations within the academy. In other words, we are not just scholars. We are indigenous scholars, and that ought to mean something, not just any scholar. Because scholar, there's a whole body of knowledge that's encoded within the Western academy on what and who is a scholar. So when you bring the aspects of indigenous scholar to it, we have to ask questions about what are the roles and expectations then of that indigenous scholar. I think it's also very, very important for us that while we work with these concerns or these issues about what Postner talks about, the fetish of authenticity, or even sometimes the narrow focus on origins and identity, we have to recognize the limits of that. Because there's a saying in the African language, or in the African proverbial saying, that it is not what you are called that is important. It is what you respond to that is most important. It is not what you are called that is important. It is what you respond to. And this is why we have to then to recognize that the notion of being an indigenous scholar is about roles, expectations. It's about implications, and it's about responsibilities. For example, we need to ask, what are our commitments to the land on which we do our scholarship? particularly those of us who talk about decolonization as a critical lens of our scholarship. So when we talk about place-based epistemologies or pedagogies, what are our commitments to the land on which we engage or do our scholarship? It's also very important for us to engage this question. I think Stephanie got at it early this morning. What do we make of the apparent discomfort in speaking about indigeneity and the indigenous in the academy? I think the point is, it is not just simply a contestation of knowledge. I think what it is that, look, it's not about the scholarly merits of indigenous knowledge. People have lived with it, they do live with it, and there's a merit to it. It is about the politics of knowledge production that is at stake here. And it's very, very uncomfortable for some because it speaks about colonization, colonial imposition of knowledge. It challenges that. It subverts the dominance of particular bodies of knowledge when you speak about indigenous. And this is why some people find it so discomforting. And so for me, for the indigenous scholar, being aware of this discomfort is not to say then that you mirror that knowledge to suit the wishes of the dominant. It's to say you articulate that knowledge in order to resist the imposition of colonial knowledge. Also, what are the tensions? We need to engage this. What are the tensions and sometimes the contradictions in claiming rights within the academy when we know that within the academy, rights are supposed to be the prerogative of particular bodies? And I think for us as indigenous scholars, it cannot just be about rights. It has to be about responsibilities. That if you have a right to be in certain spaces, that's just one bit of the story. The bigger part of the story is what responsibilities are evoked by those rights that we seek. And that means critical in the way we conceptualize our role as indigenous scholars. But we also have to ask this question about the limits of our scholarship, particularly when it gives these questions of the elitism. Earlier on, Tim talked about the word expert. That when the academy, when we talk about the expert is the all-knowing. And sometimes that gives us some sort of elitist position that we take, that we know it more than others, that we abrogate to ourselves that knowledge. And I think for me, the indigenous scholar, we have to be aware of the limits of this professionalism of the scholar. And sometimes also address the charges that we betray our communities. How many times do some of us put our own communities under the bus just because we want to seek validation, legitimation in the eyes of the dominant in the academy? To what extent do we speak about the concerns, the needs and aspirations of our communities? And do we study our communities from a distance? Or we are situated, centered, anchored within our communities when we articulate our scholarship? We also need to be aware of sometimes the way knowledge production proceeds in the academy. The class and the gendered hierarchies of knowledge production in terms of who becomes the knowledge producer and who becomes the knowledge consumer. And as an indigenous scholar, we need to be aware of the way these are navigated in the academy and challenge that. And also to challenge the ways in which we are caught in the class-based privileges of the academy to the extent of how the academy rewards proximity to whiteness. If you are able to articulate in certain ways, you're more seen as excellent. You're more seen as an expert. You're more seen as an intellectual. And this proximity to whiteness and the access that it affords, it's a currency. And we need to be aware that we don't buy into that, this currency, and how it's important to basically to challenge that. So this then leads me to the question of why it's so important to reconceptualize the indigenous scholar. And to me, when we speak of the indigenous scholar, we are speaking about a holistic, embodied learner working with and through our married identities, particularly our spiritual identities. Spirituality as a site of knowing, spirituality as embodied, Spirituality as the entry point through which we produce our knowledge as indigenous scholars. That we are also learners with a complex relations to our cultures, to our histories, to our politics, identities, and that we have that capacity for aesthetic appreciation. And this, to me, is how we begin to reconceptualize that indigenous scholar. Also, it means showing a deeper awareness and appreciation of the rich intellectual heritage of indigenous scholarship. And for me, particularly for somebody who articulates an African indigeneity, the charge then becomes not just simply documenting this rich intellectual heritage, but also placing it on an equal footing with other bodies of knowledge, and also being able to share this knowledge across geographical spaces in the tradition of anti-colonial modernity. That is to say that we articulate this knowledge, engage this knowledge, put it on equal footing, share this knowledge as a way to engage in anti-colonial resistance to the colonial imposition of dominant knowledges. It is also an acknowledgement of the complex interface of indigenous scholarship with creative intellectual thought, anti-colonial practice that goes way back to the ways that our peoples have challenged ideologies of the authentic. When I speak of challenging the ideologies of the authentic, it gets back to the earlier point that I made. That to me is not just simply talking about a purity, but it's to talk about the politics of claiming that body of knowledge as a way to resist colonial imposition. How then do we see the indigenous scholar today, and what are some of our challenges? I think for me, foremost, our work should be about interruption. It should be about subversion, and it should be about decolonization. We cannot have decolonization without speaking about indigenous. The two work in tandem, indigenous and decolonization. We also have to claim an ontological reality and existence of the indigenous, which is beyond the question of color, and here I'm speaking for me as an African scholar, or even the question of identity politics. But you talk of spiritual relations to the land, getting back to my point, that what does it mean to talk about decolonial scholarship on particular lands? In this case, for me as an African scholar, to speak about decolonization on Aboriginal and Indigenous people's land. And what does it mean to engage the teachings of Mother Earth? Just to give you an example of what I mean by this, in terms of these teachings. We know, for example, that in the academy, there's so much of individualism that even learners begin to see themselves as individual learners. If you are indigenous scholars, how do we begin to work in communities to assist each other? How do we begin to mentor each other? This is working with the teachings of Mother Earth, which is about mentoring, it's about community, it's about reciprocity, it's about sharing. How do we bring these ideas into the academy? In an academy where the space is more about individualism, it's about each one for himself or herself. How do we subvert that? And how do we reclaim our indigeneity and our indigenousness for a revolutionary spiritual consciousness? I think earlier on when Suzanne spoke, she talked about the question of knowing who one is. To me, that is in the language of spiritual consciousness. It's about this sense of knowing one's identity, which is beyond simply race, class, gender, but also engage the question of spiritual identities, knowing who one is or what one is. It's also important in terms of talking about the indigenous scholar today that we don't become what Inyamno talks about, intellectual imposters. Many of us have become intellectual imposters. We are not who we are. We mimic. Homi Baba, we colonial mimicry. Sometimes we want to position, we want to present these bodies of knowledge in ways that are going to be acceptable to the dominant. So we mimic. And we are being forced to present these bodies of knowledge in ways that are going to be understood by others, rather than presenting these bodies of knowledge that are actually true to ourselves. We are being true to ourselves, true to our souls, our spirits, our bodies, and our minds as indigenous learners. It also means we become distinctive indigenous anti-colonial voice in the academy. And this is something I'm very big in Toronto that I talk about, for me, becoming a distinctive black voice in the academy. It also means becoming a distinctive indigenous voice in the academy. It also means engaging a politics of embodiment that allows one to question the epistemologies and the frameworks that we work with. Europe is not the beginning of world history. And we need to challenge the way certain frameworks have been presented and are being consumed in a way that sees Europe as the advent of human history. But it also means fundamentally becoming rebels or academic warriors. It's not enough simply to be a scholar. We have to become rebels and warriors. We cannot see what is happening in our communities. The disengagement, the push out, the exclusions, and simply say we want to steady our communities for the sake of knowledge. We want to be activists. We want to be warriors. That knowledge for the sake of knowledge is not enough. That we must take a position that is at the foremost, at the heart of our communities, their needs and constraints and their ambitions. That is not enough to become a scholar or public intellectual. I think to me, a public intellectual is anybody who speaks about public matters. But we need to move beyond that to become warriors, academic warriors, if we are going to be true indigenous scholars. That we also have to understand what is required in the politics of territoriality, which is a term I borrowed from one of my doctoral students, which is to say, when we come into certain spaces, it's not enough to say, I belong here, I have a right to be here. But what are the responsibilities that come with asking about those rights to be here? That you have a right to be here, but what are your responsibilities to either open the doors very wide to ensure that others come after you, to ensure that the gates are left open, that the exclusionary places that we have within our institutions are made more inclusive. That means the politics of territoriality, that it's not enough to be in a space and claim that we have every right to be there. But what are your responsibilities? What politics are we going to engage in that will make our institutions very inclusive, that will make our institutions realize that business cannot be as usual, that there must be a way of revisioning our institutions, that there must be a way to talk about something different is possible. And we must also be searching for what I've recently been writing about, and I call a trialectic space. This trialectic space speaks about the interface of the body, mind, and soul. That the academy cannot be what Shahjahan talks about, a spiritual proof fence. That somehow when we get into our institutions, there's no sign within our institutions that says you are entering an Eurocentric institution. I don't think when you go to our universities, there's a sign that says you are entering an Eurocentric institution. But we know it by what goes on in our institutions. And we must be able to challenge that by speaking about our institutions becoming trialectic spaces. Spaces where we engage the body, mind, and soul in tandem. Where we are able to talk of the interface between society, culture, nature, and also be able to speak about the intersections of the physical and the metaphysical. That we cannot, or we can no longer afford to say, keep your spirituality outside the gates of our institutions. That spiritual proof fence that our institutions have mounted against certain bodies of knowledge need to be broken. And as indigenous scholars, we have that responsibility to break that spiritual proof fence in our institutions. And we must also remember that as indigenous scholars, we are on a journey. And these journeys are journeys of resistance. And that these journeys of resistance are taking place in the field of what Fanon calls combat. I mentioned it in the session with the graduate students, that when we look at our academy, nobody is firing guns, literally, nobody is firing guns. But guns are being drawn because of knowledge contestations. Whose knowledge counts? Whose experiences are valid? Whose histories are devalued? Whose experiences are negated, are omitted, or are dismissed? These mere struggles. They are contestations of knowledge. And being an indigenous scholar in the academy is to remember that we are in journeys of resistance. And these resistances are taking place in the field of intellectual combat. And therefore, we cannot afford to decouple our intellectuality from a polity and sociality. In other words, that independence of scholarship and activism, for me, is a luxury that the indigenous scholar cannot afford. The separation of politics and scholarship is a luxury. And as indigenous scholars, we cannot afford that luxury. Some can afford it. We cannot afford it. And we need to go back to what I said. We cannot look at what is happening in our communities and say we are going to separate scholarship from activism. It's a luxury. We cannot afford it. I conclude with some personal questions that I've been dealing with myself of late as I begin to write about some of these things. For me, for example, there's a question that I need to address, and I think, to me, Stephanie talks on it a bit about it. And when she spoke, I was basically trying to situate myself in that discussion. What does it mean for me as an African scholar to pursue studies about African indigeneity in the context of the white colonial settlerhood? To me, it's about speaking about implications and responsibilities. It's about speaking about implications and responsibilities. I know some people are talking about complicities. I don't want to go there. I want to talk about implications and responsibilities in a way that brings a sort of solidarity, where the solidarity is talked about in the sense that others speak about, which is a decolonized solidarity that recognizes the histories, the different histories, the power relations, and the extent to which we are implicated, but we are implicated differently. And the reason why this is important for me is that I don't want to leave the power of the colonial dominant off the hook. That we have to be very careful that as we engage different bodies in this discourse of settlerhood, we don't leave the white colonial settler off the hook. It's very, very important. Secondly, for me, a question that I need to engage as an indigenous scholar is, I'm bringing a broad theorization into indigeneity. And what are the implications of that? Does that mean I'm watering down the notion of indigeneity? Or am I bringing that broad theorization in a way to bring a complex reading to the word indigenous? I believe it is the latter. And to me, I don't take the position that the indigenous is static, is frozen. If someone believes that the indigenous or the traditional is static or frozen, then that understanding exists only in their imagination. Because for the indigenous peoples, for the traditional peoples, if we accept that they live with this knowledge, then living is a continual process. So living cannot be static. It's a continual process. So it is actually a misnomer to talk about tradition is about static, when you know that tradition is about place-based knowledge. And that place-based knowledge is about living, which is a continual process. So for me to bring that understanding, a broad understanding to indigeneity, which evokes indigenousness in different contexts, is also to understand that there's a complexity to the term indigenous. And that complexity calls for a critical reading rather than say we abolish the term indigenous. Because indigenous speaks for something. It speaks about a resistance to colonial imposition. Indigenous allows us to engage in decolonization. Indigenous allows us to speak about colonialism and colonial oppression and ongoing colonizations. And lastly, to me, when we pursue these discourses as counter-narratives or as oppositional discourses, I'm not interested in the search for validation or legitimation in the academy. That's not my goal. I'm not interested in the search for validation or legitimation. I pursue this body of knowledge because it's legitimate in its own right. Thank you.
Chief Įłàà, we raise our hands to you with utmost respect. What a beautiful way to close this wonderful day.